President Trump's order to eliminate waste and save taxpayer dollars by consolidating procurement brings some old procurement practices back into fashion. Over the next 60 to 90 days, agencies have a lot of work to do to centralize procurement of common items back to the General Services Administration. To understand what this means for the procurement system, Federal News Network's Terry Gerton spoke with former GSA Administrator and current Senior Fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting, Emily Murphy.
Emily, the effort to centralize procurement in GSA has been on again and off again for decades. You had an inside seat as the administrator of GSA. What is it that makes this vision so hard to actualize?
So I think that there are a lot of challenges with centralizing procurement, and they go back to sort of the history of why GSA existed. If you remember, until 1949, there was no GSA. Agencies did things separately. President Truman had the idea that in consolidating things would get a lot of efficiencies, but those efficiencies became pretty stagnant over the years. And by the 80s, it was joked that GSA stood for going slowly always. So the reforms of the 90s, GSA lost control of a lot of the procurement. It had to compete for things and it became really efficient and effective. But we lost sort of the government's leverage buying power in a lot of cases as well. So I think this is a challenge right now to try and figure out how we can leverage the government's buying power, get those efficiencies, but maintain all the things that I think makes GSA a really great agency and a great buying activity.
So, what is it that makes this a good time to try this centralization again?
Well, there's an enormous appetite right now for procurement reform. If you're looking at the Hill, you've got Senator Wicker's got his Forged Act. We're hearing more and more conversations about how we need to be evolving procurement. We're seeing more use of OTA, other transactions authorities, and commercial solutions openings. So there's this enormous appetite out there to do it better, and there's a huge push to save money. And there's, I think, a recognition that centralizing buying could make things less expensive for the government, but it could also make things less expensive for the companies that are trying to do business with the government. Because when I was running GSA, one of the biggest complaints we got was we spend all our time chasing RFIs, chasing bids and proposals, competing for duplicative contract vehicles, and that costs companies money. And the companies pass those costs along to the government. If it's a cost-based contract, it goes into their overhead costs. If not, it's going, if it's a firm fixed price, it's definitely being reflected in the underlying price. So this is a chance to try to remove some of that burden from those companies. But it also does create a sort of winner takes all situation so that if you have one of those contracts, you're going to be in a much better spot going forward.
Right, right. So let's talk about what it actually is going to mean to meet the goals of this executive order, right? Agencies have 60 days from March 20th to submit their consolidation plans to GSA. What would you expect to see when they submit those plans?
I think the first thing they're going to go through and distinguish is what they have that falls into those 10 common categories that are called out by the executive order, that are the category management categories. So what there is suitable for consolidation and what isn't. And I think that's the first distinction they're going to make. And I suspect that there are some cases where even though some things like, I'll give an example, pharmaceuticals are listed as one of the common categories, it might be something that VA or DoD decides that they have more expertise in, and it doesn't make sense to consolidate. So I think that there are going to be a lot of discussions around that. I think there are going to be discussions around personnel. Are the people going to move with the procurements? How about the funding for those people? Is it going to come along with them, or is GSA going to retain a fee-based structure and charge for those procurements going forward? So, and then contract writing systems. Which contract writing system are they going to use? How are you going to communicate things back and forth? How are the financial systems going to communicate with each other? So there are a lot of issues that have to be addressed in those plans.
Let's talk about the personnel for a minute because GSA had some folks that took the fork in the road option and they're downsizing themselves. How really could you set up personnel, whether they stay in the agencies, will they transfer to GSA? What do you really think is reasonable there?
Well, I don't know if you noticed, but GSA actually reopened the fork in the road. And so they've got it open again through, I think, the middle of April. So I think that there is an expectation that at least some of the 1102s, the contract specialists out there, might be picked up by GSA. I think that even within GSA, that there's some hope that some of the contract specialists within the public building service will move over into the federal acquisition service to help perform the work. So that we won't lose all of that expertise that the government has. But I think that there's also a lot of work here and a lot fewer people who are going to be doing it. So they're going to need to use technology and find ways to do it more efficiently in order to realize not just the savings goals, but also just the efficiency goals of people need to get stuff. The government needs to buy things in order to do its job.
Well, that probably gets to the other constraints you mentioned, the contract writing system and the financial system. All the different agencies are using different software, different technologies there. How can you imagine GSA bringing all of that together?
I think it's actually a really interesting challenge. And if I were GSA, at GSA now, I'd go to the Office of Shared Services and Performance Improvement within the within the Office of Government-Wide Policy. And I know that they had done some work on what were the common standards for a contract writing system. How could they, in looking at financial management consolidation. And I think I'd use this as an opportunity to start moving agencies to to more of a shared system or to shared providers and trying to get that shared services win that we'd been looking for in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, that's been a topic of conversation for a long time, and there's some more move towards shared services on the financial side that was in a separate EO.
Yes. And I think that what we're seeing through a lot of the executive orders is really a commitment to shared services, within the federal government. I'm curious whether or not payroll will come back as a shared service or other HR processes will also reemerge as shared services.
So let's think a little bit more about agency strategy here, because you mentioned pharmaceuticals and VA and DoD being the big buyers of pharmaceuticals. When I think of somebody like FEMA who has to buy emergency construction material, a lot of it really fast compared to somebody like the Army Corps of Engineers who knows what their construction is well in advance and can have more planned procurement. How will GSA start to normalize those different kinds of buying strategies for things like the common services and goods?
Well, GSA already had identified items that it thought were appropriate for disaster response and had put in place some contracts to make it easier to do that. If you recall, states and local governments already use the GSA schedules for disaster response. So they're able to use any NAICS code within the entire schedule, any SIN within the schedules, if it's in response to a disaster. So GSA and FEMA already have a long history of GSA providing acquisition support during a disaster and setting up contracts in advance of disasters. It is going to require some more coordination, though, moving forward. And it's going to require some really good customer relationship management on GSA's behalf.
I'm speaking with Emily Murphy. She's a senior fellow at the George Mason University Baroni Center for Government Contracting and the former administrator of GSA. Emily, there's another part to this EO, which designates the administrator of GSA as the executive agent for all government-wide acquisition contracts for information technology. That's no small task, but what's that really going to mean in practice?
Well, it raises some questions about duplication in those large GUACs. And this isn't a new conversation either. If you go back to the Bush administration, GSA was at that time pushing back on the idea that NASA soup or that or CIOSP, I think at the time it might have been one or two, were duplicative of what the schedules did or what GSA's own GWACs did. I think that this is an effort to rationalize those contract vehicles. By having GSA take control of that, it's going to force GSA to really sit down and figure out what does it do best and what it was good in other contract vehicles that we need to be keeping. It's going to be a fascinating tale to sort of watch unfold.
Those are huge contracts.
Huge contracts. Now, one thing you've got going for you is that both CIOSP4 has been in a bit of distress for the last several years. It had so many protests. And so it seems to be stuck. And GSA is going to then have to decide, does it want to push forward and get to a final award? Or does that mean the end of CISP4? SOUP 6 is still in the RFP process. So there's also, it would be a natural point for a SOUP to be revisited. So you'd close out SOUP 5 without having a SOUP 6. Or maybe you look at SOUP 6 and say it was going to do something different in terms of services. And that's something that we want to keep. And that's going to require a lot of debate within GSA and a lot of conversations with the customers about how well do contract vehicles meet their needs.
So we're talking about big projects, big contracts.